The town sat in a natural basin, ringed by low mountains to the north and sprawling farmland to the south. Population, just under 800. The nearest city was 70 miles away down a two-lane highway that cut through forest and open prairie. In winter, this isolation was simply a fact of life. Most residents had generators in their garages, wood piles stacked against their homes, and pantries stocked with enough to last a week or more. They knew how to wait out weather. It was mid-February, the kind of cold that made breath hang in the air like smoke. For 3 days, the temperature had held steady around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, unpleasant but manageable. The sky was a flat, colorless gray, the sort that pressed down on the landscape and made everything feel smaller. Snow lay in patches across yards and fields, crusted over from previous storms, hard enough to walk on without breaking through. On the morning it began, the town moved through its usual rhythms. The general store opened at 7. The school bus made its rounds, headlights cutting through pre-dawn darkness. At the volunteer fire station, 2 men sat drinking coffee from thermoses, listening to the scanner. The local radio station played its morning program, weather, livestock prices, a few dedications. The forecast mentioned snow, possibly heavy beginning late afternoon. Accumulation, 6 to 10 inches. Wind gusts up to 30 miles per hour, standard winter fare for the region. But there were signs, small ones, that something different was forming. The barometric pressure had been dropping steadily since midnight, a slow, continuous fall that meteorologists in the regional office watched with growing unease. By mid-morning, it had fallen further than models predicted. Surface temperatures were cooling faster than expected. Aloft, at 10,000 feet, winds were accelerating. 2 weather systems, one pushing down from the Arctic, another sliding east from the Rockies, were beginning to merge over the northern plains. On the ground, these shifts registered as sensations more than data. The air felt heavier. The wind, which had been light and sporadic, began to move with more purpose, gusting from the northwest in irregular pulses. Birds that normally perched along fence lines were absent. The sky remained gray, but the quality of the light changed, diffuse, directionless, as though the sun had been erased entirely. By noon, the first flakes appeared. Light, dry, barely visible. They didn't fall so much as drift laterally, carried on the wind. A woman stepping out of the post office paused, looked up, then pulled her coat tighter and walked to her truck. At the school, a teacher standing by the window watched snow begin to dust the playground equipment. It seemed unremarkable. At 1 o'clock, the local weather service upgraded the forecast. Winter storm warning. Expected snowfall, 12 to 18 inches. Winds increasing to 40 miles per hour with gusts to 55. Blowing and drifting snow. Travel strongly discouraged after 4 p.m. The message went out over the radio. The sheriff's department posted it on their community board. A few people made quick trips to the store for batteries or milk, but most stayed where they were. 18 inches was manageable. 50-mile-per-hour winds were unpleasant but not catastrophic. The town had weathered worse. What no one yet understood was that the storm intensifying over them wasn't following the predicted track. The 2 colliding systems had created something more organized, more powerful. The low-pressure center was deepening rapidly, a process meteorologists call bombogenesis. Within 6 hours, the system would have the pressure gradient of a hurricane. But hurricanes are visible from space, tracked for days, their paths mapped and publicized. This storm was forming in near real time, over land, in winter, in a region where infrastructure was sparse and communication depended on lines that could be buried in minutes. By 2 o'clock, the snow was falling steadily. Flakes were smaller now, harder, driven nearly horizontal by wind that had shifted to blow directly out of the north. Visibility dropped to half a mile. The temperature fell to 8 degrees. Wind chill, -15. The school superintendent, watching from his office, made the call to dismiss students early. Buses were dispatched at 2:30. They rolled out into snow that was already beginning to drift across the roads, piling against fence posts and embankments. Drivers turned on their flashers, crept along at 20 miles per hour, windshield wipers working overtime. Every child made it home. The last bus returned to the depot at 3:15. 15 minutes later, the storm arrived in earnest. By 3 in the afternoon, the highway patrol had closed the main roads. The decision came quickly, based on reports from plow drivers who'd been forced to turn back after encountering zero visibility and drifts forming faster than they could clear them. One driver radioed in that he'd passed the same mile marker 3 times without realizing it. Another reported his truck's windshield was icing over faster than the defroster could handle, even at full blast. The snow was no longer falling, it was being driven. The wind had accelerated to 40, then 50 miles per hour, pulling snow off the fields and hurling it across the roads in thick, churning waves. The distinction between what was falling from the sky and what was being scoured off the ground disappeared. It was all just white, moving, relentless. In town, people began to understand this wasn't routine. The power flickered twice before 4 o'clock. Lights dimmed, brightened, then held. But the flicker was enough to send people to their basements, checking flashlights and candles. The grocery store saw a brief rush, not panic but purpose. People grabbed milk, bread, batteries. The clerk at the register mentioned later that no one spoke much. They just moved quickly, paid, and left. By 5, the streetlights came on automatically, glowing faint and orange through the thickening snow. Within 20 minutes, they were barely visible. The snow piled against storefronts, against parked cars, against anything that interrupted the wind's path. Drifts began to form with startling speed, 3 feet high in some places, nearly flat in others, sculpted by the wind into sharp, uneven ridges. The volunteer fire department tried to send a truck to check on an elderly resident on the edge of town. They made it 2 blocks before the driver radioed back. The road was gone. Not buried, gone. There was no way to tell where the pavement ended and the ditch began. The truck returned to the station. The radio station stayed on the air broadcasting updates, but the information was increasingly limited. The National Weather Service had upgraded the warning to a blizzard warning with wind chills dropping below -30. Travel was not advised. Travel was impossible. The station manager read the update in his usual calm voice, then added a note of his own. If you're home, stay home. If you're not, find shelter now. By 6, the phone lines began to fail. Not all at once, there was no dramatic crash. Just a growing number of calls that wouldn't connect, lines that rang once and went dead, conversations interrupted by static. The cell tower, located on the ridge west of town, was taking the full force of the wind. Ice was building up on the equipment. The signal weakened, dropped, returned sporadically. People tried texting. Some went through, most didn't. And then the power went out. It happened at 6:47 p.m. according to the digital clocks that froze in place. One moment the hum of refrigerators and furnaces and electronics filled homes. The next, silence. Not complete silence. Outside, the wind was a constant roar, a sound like freight trains or low-flying aircraft that never passed. But inside, without the mechanical sounds of modern life, the homes felt suddenly fragile. Flashlights clicked on, candles were lit, wood stoves were stoked. People moved through their homes slowly, conserving energy, thinking through the logistics. How much firewood was left? How much food? How long this might last? Outside, the world had disappeared. Windows showed nothing but white. Not the gentle white of falling snow, but an opaque, churning, featureless white. Looking outside was like looking into static. Depth perception vanished. Some people described it as claustrophobic despite being indoors. Others said it felt like the house was adrift, untethered, floating in some vast white void. The snow wasn't just falling, it was erasing. By midnight, the drifts had climbed past windowsills. Inside, families huddled near heat sources, wood stoves, fireplaces, kerosene heaters. Blankets were layered. Rooms not being used were closed off to conserve warmth. The temperature inside homes dropped slowly but steadily. 55 degrees, 50, 48. Breath became visible indoors. Water left in glasses developed a thin skin of ice by morning. There was no way to know what was happening outside without opening a door, and opening a door was risky. The first person to try found a solid wall of snow pressed against the frame. It didn't fall inward like loose powder. It held its shape, compacted by wind into something dense, almost structural. He had to use a shovel to carve a gap large enough to squeeze through. When he did, the wind hit him with enough force to make him stagger. He retreated immediately, forcing the door shut, brushing snow from his face and collar. The storm showed no sign of weakening. Through the night the wind howled, not in gusts, but in a sustained mechanical roar. It found every gap, every crack, every poorly sealed window. Snow forced its way through weather stripping, forming small drifts on interior windowsills. In some homes, frost formed on the inside of walls near exterior corners, delicate patterns spreading across drywall and plaster. Sleep was difficult. The wind was too loud, too constant. Children woke frequently, asking questions their parents couldn't answer. When will it stop? Will we be okay? Parents offered reassurance in low voices, though they themselves were calculating. How much fuel, how much food, how long? Some people tried to keep time by routine, eating meals at normal hours, going through the motions of bedtime. Others let time dissolve, moving through the hours without structure, waiting. The darkness outside was absolute. No streetlights, no porch lights, no headlights, just the wind and the white. By dawn, though dawn was only a theory, a slightly lighter shade of gray filtering through the snow, people began to assess. Entire vehicles had vanished. A pickup truck parked in a driveway was now just a vague mound. The propane tank beside one house was buried to the valve. Fences were gone, swallowed by drifts that rose in sweeping curves like frozen ocean swells. The mailbox at the end of one driveway was completely submerged. Only its post, a thin, dark line, marked where it had been. The town itself had disappeared beneath the snow. From above, though no one could see from above, it would have looked like a ghost town, or perhaps no town at all. Just white, interrupted by the occasional dark line of a power pole or the peak of a roof. The church steeple was still visible, its cross jutting from the white. The grain elevator, tall and industrial, stood like a lighthouse. Everything else had been swallowed. Inside homes, routines began to adapt. Cooking was done on wood stoves if possible, or not at all. Cold cereal, canned food eaten straight from the tin, melted snow for washing. People rationed firewood carefully, burning only enough to keep the temperature survivable. Conversations were sparse. There was nothing new to say. The storm continued. They waited. One resident later described the silence between the wind as the worst part. When the gusts momentarily eased, the quiet was so total it felt unnatural, like the world had stopped. Then the wind would return, and the house would shudder, and the cycle would continue. No one knew what was happening beyond their own walls. The radio was dead, no power for the transmitter. Cell phones, even those with battery, had no signal. Landlines were silent. Each household was isolated, alone in the white. Some tried to dig out to reach neighbors. They made it a few feet before the wind filled in their progress. One man attempted to walk to the house next door, a distance of 50 yards. He roped himself to his porch railing and moved forward, one slow step at a time, leaning into the wind. He made it halfway before turning back, unable to see, unable to breathe, the cold searing his lungs. The storm had created a kind of sensory deprivation. White in every direction, wind as white noise, cold as a constant pressure. Time stretched, became elastic. Minutes felt like hours, hours blurred together. And still the snow fell. By the second day, the storm had stalled. Weather systems are driven by pressure gradients, by the flow of air masses across regions. This one, pulled by a stubborn low-pressure center, had slowed to a crawl. It sat over the area, drawing in moisture, spinning snow across the same ground again and again. Meteorologists tracking it from distant offices saw the radar signature, a sprawling white mass, barely moving, covering hundreds of square miles. Rescue efforts were launched, then postponed. The National Guard staged vehicles at the edge of the storm zone, waiting for a break. Snowplows from neighboring counties were mobilized, but the roads were impassable. Not difficult, impassable. The drifts were 15–20 feet deep in places, carved by wind into hard-packed walls. Equipment designed to clear snow couldn't cut through it. Helicopters were grounded by wind and zero visibility. The governor declared a state of emergency. It was a formality. No help was coming, not yet. Inside the town, survival became local. A few residents with snowmobiles attempted to move between houses, checking on neighbors. Progress was slow. The machines bogged down in deep snow, engines straining. Visibility was still near zero, but they managed short trips door to door, street to street. They brought news. Everyone was alive. Cold, trapped, running low on supplies, but alive. One household ran out of firewood by the third morning. A neighbor 2 houses down had a surplus. The snowmobile made the trip, ferrying split logs in a plastic sled, 3 trips to move enough fuel to last another day. The town's small medical clinic was unreachable. The doctor who ran it was stuck at home like everyone else. But word spread, passed by snowmobile, by shouted conversations through cracked doors, that if anyone had an emergency, people would try, somehow. It was a fragile safety net, but it was something. Food became a shared resource. People took inventory, then compared. Those with full pantries offered canned goods. Those with generators shared gasoline. A man with a propane stove cooked batches of soup and passed containers to neighbors. It wasn't charity, it was arithmetic. Everyone would last longer if resources were pooled. The cold was the constant enemy. Homes designed for modern heating struggled without power. Pipes froze despite precautions. In one house, a water line burst behind a wall, flooding a bathroom with icy water before the main valve could be shut off. The family moved to the living room, abandoning the back half of the house to the cold. Children asked fewer questions now. They sat wrapped in blankets near stoves, reading by flashlight or sleeping. Adults spoke in practical terms. How much fuel, how much time, what to do if. By the 4th day, the wind finally began to ease. It didn't stop. Storms of this scale don't end suddenly, but the sustained roar dropped to intermittent gusts. The snow still fell, but lighter now, more vertical than horizontal. Visibility improved from 0 to maybe 100 feet, then 200. People opened doors again, stepping out into a landscape they barely recognized. The street was gone, replaced by uneven waves of snow. Drifts rose to the eaves of some houses, while others were nearly clear, scoured down to bare ground by the wind's whims. The pattern made no sense, shaped by turbulence and chance. One resident stood in what used to be his front yard, trying to orient himself. His car was buried. The fence was invisible. The mailbox was a memory. For a moment, he couldn't tell which direction the road had been. Everything was white and nothing looked right. From the grain elevator, the highest point in town, the view was surreal. The town existed only as interruptions in the snow, rooftops, chimneys, the tips of trees. The surrounding prairie was a white plain extending to the horizon, broken only by the dark line of a distant tree row. And then finally, on the 5th day, the snow stopped. The silence after the storm was profound. For 5 days the world had been wind and snow. Now it was still. The sky cleared to a hard, pale blue. The sun appeared, low and cold, casting long shadows across the drifts. The temperature remained below 0, but the wind was gone. The air felt sharp, brittle, empty. Digging began immediately. Every household with a shovel started carving paths to the road, to the neighbor's house, to the propane tank. Progress was measured in feet per hour. The snow was dense, layered, compacted by the wind into something that resisted the blade. People worked in shifts, stopping to warm their hands, then returning. The town slowly reemerged. Emergency services reached the outskirts by the sixth day. National Guard vehicles equipped with tracks pushed through the drifts, carving narrow channels. Snowplows followed, widening the paths inch by inch. Crews worked around the clock, prioritizing access to the clinic, the fire station, the main roads. When the first relief convoy arrived, it was greeted by a town that had already survived. Supplies were distributed, fuel, food, medical equipment, but most people had managed. A few needed medical attention: frostbite, hypothermia, respiratory issues from breathing cold air. But there were no fatalities. No one had been lost. The damage was structural, not human. Roofs had collapsed under the weight of snow, pipes had burst, vehicles were ruined, but these were things that could be repaired. The residents gathered in the cleared parking lot of the fire station, talking in low voices, assessing. The conversation wasn't about what had been lost. It was about what came next. Aerial footage, taken days later, showed the scale of the event. The town was a small cluster of shapes at the center of a vast white expanse. Drifts still surrounded it, towering walls of snow that would take weeks to melt. The roads out of town were narrow trenches, carved through drifts that rose higher than the vehicles that created them. Meteorologists analyzed the storm, trying to understand why it had been so severe. The low-pressure system had stalled, fed by moisture from an unusually warm lake far to the west. The wind had pulled that moisture across hundreds of miles of flat terrain, amplifying it, concentrating it. The town had been in the exact wrong place, a topographic low where snow naturally accumulated, with no barriers to slow the wind. The total accumulation was difficult to measure. In some places, the snow was less than a foot. In others, it exceeded 20 feet. The official record listed it as a Category 4 blizzard, rare, severe, and nearly unpredictable. In the months that followed, the town rebuilt. Roofs were repaired, pipes were replaced. People installed backup generators, stocked pantries more carefully, checked on neighbors more often. The storm became a reference point, a before and after marker in local history. Conversations began with, "Remember the blizzard," and everyone knew which one. But there was also a quieter legacy. The storm had stripped away the assumption of connectivity. For 5 days, the outside world had been irrelevant, unreachable. The only thing that mattered was who was in the next house, who had fuel, who needed help. That intimacy didn't disappear when the roads reopened. The town had learned what it could endure and who it could rely on. Years later, when winter storms appeared on the forecast, people watched the barometer more carefully. They stocked up earlier. They checked in with neighbors without being asked. The memory of those 5 days lingered, not as trauma, but as knowledge. The town had been buried, and it had survived. The storm became a story passed down, embellished slightly with each retelling, but always grounded in the same core truth: that when the world disappeared into white, when communication failed and roads closed and cold pressed in from all sides, the town had endured by turning inward. Neighbor to neighbor, house to house, one shovel of snow at a time. The whiteout had stopped time, rewritten the landscape, and tested every assumption about safety and connection. And when it finally passed, when the sky cleared and the digging began, what remained wasn't just a town. It was a community that knew, deeply and without question, what it was capable of surviving.